Yeah. A space for educators to learn effective ways to teach Black history and race through research, professional development, networking, advocacy, and consulting. Our Teaching Black History conference is coming up July 25th through the 27th. A call for proposals will be coming out soon, but you can check our website, and Abigail will drop a link in the chat where you can find out more information about the conference. But a call for proposals should be coming out soon. So you can submit your proposals and join us. We also have a Teaching Black History micro credential that is currently underway in its second semester. If you would like to know more information or are interested in signing up and joining us in the fall, you can contact Dee or Abigail, and I have their emails here on the slide. And then Abigail can drop her email in the chat as well and share some more information. And coming up on January 25th is our first educator book club of the semester. And we will be reading The Three Mothers, which will be facilitated by Daphne Bibbs. So if you are interested in joining us, go ahead and purchase your book, and you want to scan that QR code, or there'll be a link in the chat, and you can join us for this 4-week book club. And it begins on January 25th at 10 a.m. Eastern, and it'll be via Zoom. All right, our next nerd session is February 1st with Dr. Charles McKinney, looking at a rising imbalance, civil rights, and the demise of Black republicanism in the 1960s. But today, our feature nerd is Akil Parker, who again will be talking to us about Criminal Minded, the Mathematics of Slave Rebellions. And I'll allow him to introduce himself and dive in. If you have any questions or things throughout his presentation, please put those in the chat. And then we will share those with him at the end of his presentation. And if you feel led, you can unmute yourself and ask questions at the end.
So, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. Thank you for coming to the presentation where, I'm basically a person that has been a math teacher for the past 20 years, but my students would always complain, well, not really complain, but say that I should have been an African American history teacher whenever we were in class because I would always end up
Something like
trying
it.
to
I don't know how to do it.
incorporate Black history into mathematics lessons in different ways. And I think that's important. And I was really trying to I've always tried to be intentional in terms of doing that because I think that it's important in terms of really even understanding history, being able to do quantitative analysis. Because it's interesting how I wonder how, like, I've had students in my classrooms, whether it be an algebra class or pre-algebra class or some type of math course where they may not understand percentages, right? And this is exposed in my class. So I'm like, okay, I have to teach you percentages, teach you the concept of percentages, teach you how percentages work. Which of course, in order to really understand percentages, you need to have a fundamental understanding of fractions, an understanding of ratios and proportions, and just those types of number relationships, right? But it gets exposed in a math class. But I wonder how many of those students were able to go to their history class and the history teacher may ask them, read this passage or read this paragraph, or the teacher may read the paragraph or give out a worksheet, and it includes a percentage. So when they're reading this, but if you don't understand, like, it may say, like, 45% of Americans did this in 1922, and they may be able to recognize the numbers, recognize the percentage symbol, recognize the words in the passage or the paragraph, but it's clear that they can't possibly understand what they just read in reality because they don't have the foundational mathematics understanding. So I try to take any way I possibly can to basically teach what I call histematics, which is the short version of that. Short description of that would be using Black history to teach mathematics and using math and vice versa, using mathematics to teach Black history, right? And this presentation is just another opportunity to do that. And it's also like very, important to me to talk about slave rebellions because I think the merciful white abolitionists. But we don't hear about the black people that were fighting on a daily basis in many different ways, sometimes through armed struggle, but also in other ways. And I tend to think that, it'd be very meaningful to just talk about slave rebellions, right? And then also talk about the other dynamics of the chattel slavery system, the peculiar institution, as it has been referred to by some scholars in the past. So this is a way for me to discuss slave rebellions, which I think are very important, especially the black children, because there are a lot of black children that do not even want to talk about slavery because usually when they learn about slavery or hear about slavery, it's always about somebody getting beat, somebody getting whipped, somebody getting killed, somebody getting tortured. And as a child, I probably, for my own mental health reasons, I probably wouldn't want to learn about that either. But when you learn about somebody that fought back, that was perhaps, triumphant. I mean, you think about the Haitian Revolution from 1791 to 1804 as a large scale slave rebellion where, African people actually won. These are stories that, are very important. So today, I'm going to talk about a little bit about, not a whole lot, not anything exhaustive, but a little bit about three different slave rebellions. The Christiana slave revolt of 1851, um, and then also the German Coast Rebellion in New Orleans, as well as the what's the third rebellion is the Baptist War, which took place in Jamaica, or the Christmas Rebellion, which took place. It started on Christmas Day in 1831. Incidentally, the same year as Nat Turner's slave rebellion in Southampton, Virginia. So I talked a little bit about histematics already, but I guess some more technical. I'll give you like the technical aspects of histematics. So I've broken it down into five elements: numerical and verbal triggers, where we create math problems, right? That end up with intentionally that end up with certain numbers, right? So I might create an addition problem, right? Where the sum of the problem is going to be 1,804. And I already mentioned the Haitian Revolution, right? So then that would be a nice segue into a conversation about the Haitian Revolution, because if the answer to the problem is 1,804, that's also the year 1804. And then we talk about significant things in history that took place in 1804, such as that. Or we could do the same thing with 1791. Or, I might, have a problem where 381 is one of the relevant numbers, which is the amount of days that the Montgomery bus boycott lasted. So there's a lot of, you have a lot of leeway with this. And then there are verbal triggers also. Like there are a lot of mathematical terms that, we hear and we see in text, when we're studying history, such as like inflection points. And you really start to see the overlap between algebra, mathematics, and history as well. So those are ways to say, okay, well, in this context, in this history lesson, this is what this term means. But then in mathematics, it may be even in pre-calculus, if you're graphing a function or something, one of those things that people tend to like shy away from because we've been conditioned to think that math is hard, or I'm not gonna say hard because it can be difficult. Math can be difficult, but we tend to think it's insurmountable, like it's undoable, right? So, just drawing the comparison between the terminology. And also then we go to element two, which is African centered word problems and applications. Really just, and that's what this presentation is, just from an African centered perspective, centering black people in the slavery experience and saying, okay, well, we're gonna talk about how we fought back, right? How we're trying to like claim our freedom and assert our humanity, right? Um, and creating math problems based on that information and based on those details of those experiences. And then, conceptual double entendres. I take that from like, being growing up being a fan of hip hop and, the more talented artists are very skilled with double entendres, using a term, that means like the same thing, it means two different things, right? But in different contexts though, right? So, we might be talking about, I've talked about radical equations before, right? Where, if we understand like, the black radical tradition and like, COINTELPRO, what, the government may have done to, radical black revolutionary leaders, first to isolate them and then attempt to eliminate them, right? But when you're teaching a lesson in an algebra two course, probably algebra two, maybe in pre-calculus, but where you have to solve what we call radical equations, it's the same process. When you look at the equation, you want to isolate the radical term by itself on one side of the equal sign, whether it be the left side or the right side of the equal sign, and then you want to eliminate the radical sign by doing the opposite operation to it. So that's a way to teach that mathematical process, but also have the conversation about what has been the experience of Black radicals, such as maybe in Assata Shakur or Mumia Abu Jamal, or different people throughout history, or even like a Paul Robeson. And there's so many opportunities to do this, to make math more relevant in the context of history. And then fourth element, statistics of the African experience, where we talk about z-scores and p-values and confidence intervals, but we talk about the African history, in terms of that. And last but not least, the math exemplars of African descent. A lot of children, I'm of the believe that they can't do math and math is not for them because they just haven't seen Black people doing math. So they just have to see Black people doing math. A lot of them have seen Black people playing basketball, rapping, singing, dancing. So they may believe that they can do that, but they have not seen enough Black people doing math, and not just not let alone like math teachers. Were not doing math until they got to the United States, because we were doing math since the beginning of civilization, in ancient Africa, right? You think about, Imhotep in ancient Kemet, and Hippocrates, who was a Greek, and doctors take the Hippocratic Oath, which is named for Hippocrates, who was known as a medical doctor or medical practitioner in Greece. But Hippocrates is known to have said, "I'm the son of Imhotep." And similar to somebody like a Pythagoras, and we all probably learned the Pythagorean theorem. And but you know, Pythagoras studied in ancient Kemet for 22 years. So these are things that are very important, for our children to understand, and not just, and even if they learn about, black mathematics scholars and black math PhDs in the United States, they still should understand that it doesn't begin. We didn't start doing math, after slavery, because oftentimes a lot of conversations, historical conversations about our experience do get framed that way. And it tends to make people think, well, it's a good thing we were enslaved and brought to America, because look how advanced we are now. Because in Africa, we wasn't doing none of this, which is just untrue, right? So it's important about like where you start the story at, and where you begin the conversation. So these are the five elements of Histematics. And these are some things I was considering when I was thinking about this topic and this concept of, criminal minded, which was Boogie Down Productions KRS-One song from the 1980s, which was one of my favorite songs when I was young. But I think about criminality and a criminal enterprise. I look at this society as a criminal enterprise, and there's plenty of evidence to support that claim. Um, but what does it mean to be considered a criminal? Because those that led slave rebellions were criminals. They were considered criminals. They were breaking the law. We think about the fugitive slave law of 1851, when the Christiana slave revolt took place. These brothers that ran away, they were essentially stealing themselves. And Miller Fillmore, who was the president at the time, he called in the militia and charged them with treason. They were going against the United States. It was active treason and active terror by them running away. And then when the slaveholder, Edward Gorsuch and his crew came to try to take them back, and they resisted, they were breaking the law just for trying to assert their humanity. So this is something that we have to think about. Um, and I think and I think we should like probably embrace that concept. I mean, I think sometimes we want to like shy away from being labeled in certain ways and being labeled as criminals. But I think we have to look at the larger context, and that's really a mathematical approach too. It's a mathematical way of thinking, because yeah, we might think on the surface, it may be negative to be associated with criminality, but you have to think about in what context. So if I'm a criminal in a criminal enterprise, it's quite possible that I might be doing the right thing. I might be a good human because if I'm a person that is trying to teach black people how to read when it's against the law, I think I'm doing the right thing. I remember, studying some of Dr. King's work and Dr. King talking about, us having a moral obligation to disobey immoral laws, right? And that was one of his critiques. He talks about this in the letter from a Birmingham jail, which is published in his second book, Why We Can't Wait. And he talks about the white moderates, you know, um, them being even more problematic than those that were members of the Ku Klux Klan or the White Citizens Council because they privileged order over justice, law and order over justice, and just wanted to, go along to get along. So they were even more of a problem, and also there were more of them, in those groups. And I already mentioned how we can teach about chattel slavery from the perspective of the slave rebellion. I think we should do a lot more of that, and even create a whole curricula, which is based on that, because there were so many rebellions. And then, and I think more black children, especially, would definitely want to learn more about that, you know, and then also gives them an opportunity to have some different heroes, so they don't have to, you know, only look up to rappers and commercial entertainers and things like that. Um, and then also the concept of that we are not our ancestors. These kind of miseducated people that want to wear T-shirts and say I'm not my ancestors, and because they haven't been educated, they don't understand that we have always fought and we've always resisted and we've always stood up. So I think also teaching about slave rebellions as a focal point will serve to address some of those concerns and that type of ignorance, which can create great problems in our community, among our people, thinking that, they themselves may be the first people to ever stand up. Um, and also I wore this hoodie intentionally today because this is my slave rebellion hoodie where I got Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, Charles Deslandes, who was one of the leaders of the German Coast Rebellion down in New Orleans. And then Colonel Johnson, who I believe that's referring to Colonel Johnson, who was an actor in the Christmas Rebellion, or the Baptist, or also known as the Baptist War of 1831, which took place in December. Well, it started on Christmas Day, in Jamaica. All right, so Christiana slave revolt. Now I'm gonna talk a little. I'm not gonna talk a whole lot about like the background, but I'm gonna talk about like some math problems. Like what are some math problems we could do? Because it's about the history, but it's also about the math. Um, because that's key. Because I want like children to be able to like not only learn about the stories, but also learn how they can quantify the data and quantify the information. You know, so Christiana slave revolt takes place on September the 11th, 1851 in Christiana, PA. There was a guy named Edward Gorsuch who had a plantation in about maybe 20, 30 miles north of Baltimore. Anybody's familiar with Baltimore, like the Hunt Valley area, like off of 83, if you're driving up 83. The Hunt Valley area. When I was in college, I worked a couple jobs out in Hunt Valley back in the day. Um, it was a town called Moncton, Maryland. I think present day Moncton, Maryland. Um, and these four brothers like escaped and when it ran away to a town, ended up in a town called Christiana, Pennsylvania, which is not that far from present day Lincoln University, maybe 20 miles from Lincoln University. So as I tell the story, like some math problems I would also offer is, for all of us, even on this call, or this in this Zoom meeting, how old were you in 1851? Right now, that's what I call this. That we're dealing with negative ages. Right now, a lot of people, if you hear that, you might think that sounds crazy because you would say, "Well, I wasn't born in 1851, so how could I have an age?" But the purpose of that exercise is to teach the concept of negative numbers. So what everybody would do, like myself, for example, I was born in the year 1980. So I would do the math and find the difference between 1980 and the year 1851. And I would do that. And I might do it this way. I might find the difference between 1980 and the year 1900, which is 80 years. And then I take 1851 and I round that down to 1850. And then I find the difference between 1850 and 1900, and then I combine those two differences. It's called some textbooks may call that the combined differences method, right? So that's 80 plus 50, that's 130. But I have to compensate for the fact that I rounded down. So it's actually not 130 years. It's actually only 129 years. So that means I was negative 129 years old in 1851, right? And this is a way to just, kind of organically just teach the concept of negative numbers, which a lot of students end up having problems with when they get to algebra classes and pre-algebra class or pre-algebra classes, which is very foundational, which is why a lot of students, when they go through math, they end up hating math because of a lack of understanding of foundational skills. And these are things that we can do in the household with our own children because we're always telling stories about things from the past. We're telling stories about things that, we did when we were children, when we were their age, or, or things that happened just in talking about and discussing our own family histories. These are things we can do. We can deal with like negative agents. And as we talk about historical events, we can do this. We can definitely do the same thing with that. So anything that happens, we can ask the children like, how old were you? And I think it also becomes meaningful when, in order to provide like a better context of like how far ago this was. Like I was born in 1980, and I remember learning about Dr. King and, his assassination, and even Malcolm X's assassination. And the way it was taught to me, it seemed like it was so far away. But then I thought, okay, well, I was born in 1980. King was assassinated in 68 on April the 4th. And it's like, wow, when you do the math on that, that's only 12 years. Like, there's only a 12-year gap between my birth and Dr. King's assassination, right? And then so Malcolm was assassinated in 1965. That's only a 15-year difference. 15 years is really not a relatively long period of time, right? So again, it helps to quantify history. It helps to like make more sense. As I mentioned, Christiana is about 20 miles away from the location of Lincoln University, which is a historically black college located in Pennsylvania. Kwame Osage before Kwame Nkrumah attended there for undergrad. Langston Hughes, Thurgood Marshall, different people, different people throughout history have, attended Lincoln University. Nnamdi Ezekwe, attended there after transferring from Howard University and working with William Leo Hansberry, who's a very important figure in our quest to unearth African history. And then before he goes back to Nigeria and becomes the president, the leader of Nigeria, similar to Howard Nkrumah, ends up going back to West Africa and the Gold Coast, which the name changes to Ghana and becomes the first president of an independent Ghana in 1957. So Lincoln University, we have the conversation about Lincoln and how its proximity to, Christiana, Pennsylvania. And then we could talk about, well, 20 miles, that's an imperial measurement system, right? But what about I didn't mean to do that. What about that's an imperial measurement system, but what about the metric system? We can use the metric system to, let's figure out how many kilometers that is. How many kilometers is that? You know, so just a way to just and conversions is a very important thing, right? And just developing that like that numeracy and that like numerical fluency in children is of the utmost importance because a lot of times, like, and nowadays it's even worse because now there's technology, right? So everybody, a lot of people like to say, well, why do I need to know that? I could just ask Siri. Why do I need to know that? I can ask Alexa. Or I could just use my iPhone. I can use this app. Yeah, you can do that. But once you do that, if you're at the mercy of the technology, that means it's actually not an option. It's only an option if you had the choice to do it yourself or use the technology. So many of us are being indoctrinated into this idea of the technology being the computer technology, I should say, because even a pen and a pencil is actually technology, technically. We're being indoctrinated into this practice of only using the computer. So if you can only use the computer and you're at the mercy of the computer, right, then it's really not an option, right? It's your only choice. If it's your only choice, it's not an option, right? So we want our children to like understand like how to do things on their own. I would ask a question, perhaps, what are the factors of four and why is four significant? Because there were four brothers that actually ran away. These four enslaved Africans that escaped from the plantation, ended up in Christiana. And the issue was, in 1851, the Fugitive Slave Act the Fugitive Slave Law had been passed, which basically just kind of changed things because then you have people just going all over the country just basically kidnapping black people, and even some of them were had never been enslaved, but people see an opportunity, and so they say, well, I'm gonna just go kidnap some black people and then sell them down south and make some money off of that, right? And some people, stood their ground and stood on business, if you will, as the youth say, and said, no, like we're not going. And this community in Pennsylvania, led by a brother named William Parker, who actually had known Frederick Douglass, who actually had been enslaved on a plantation with Frederick Douglass previously, right? Was housing these brothers and letting them live in his house. And then when Edward Gorsuch and one of his sons and one of his nephews and some other people, there was like two cops from Philly, came out there. They got shot. And that these types of stories just make me happy. They just make me feel good. They like good for my soul. To learn about how our people were able to resist and affirm their humanity and say, no, you're not taking me back to the plantation. Like we're not about to do that. I don't know what you think this is, but this ain't that. So and these are important stories. And I mentioned earlier how I believe young people need to hear more of these stories. I think grown men and women need to hear these stories too, right? Because it can serve to provide some type of optimism for us. But at any rate, there were four enslaved Africans that ran away. So we could talk about the factors of the number four. We can also talk about some of the multiples of the number four, because there's an infinite number of multiples that four has. And I think this is an important question because as a math teacher, and you ask any math teacher probably, they'll tell you this is one of the areas of confusion for a lot of children, the being able to distinguish between um factors and multiples, right? Students often will confuse the two concepts. Like, you ask them, like, what's the greatest common factor of a number, and they'll tell you a multiple. Ask them what's the least common multiple is of a number, they'll tell you a factor. So this is a way to like really just have that conversation in another context. All right, so that's a little bit about the Christiana slave revolt. And actually, in terms of so they were like, they stood their ground and they were not taken back to Maryland, right? They ended up leaving. They still had to flee and leave because, as I said, Millard Fillmore who was the president. He called in like the militia to come get them, so they fled. William Parker ended up going. As I said, he had lived on a plantation or served on a plantation in Maryland previously and knew Douglass and ended up going to Rochester and staying and hiding out in Douglas's house before then going on to Canada, traveling on to Canada. So I thought that was interesting when I learned about that. But again, a story of, black people standing their ground and saying no. Let me go to the next slide. The Christmas Rebellion, the Baptist Rebellion, right? So this was led by, Samuel Sharp, who was known as one of the Jamaican heroes, right? In the country of Jamaica, started on Christmas Day, 1831, December 25th. So what I would say, I would ask a similar question as I did with the Christiana slave revolt. Like, how old were you in 1831? How old were you when this started and this took place? And as I mentioned, this took place the same year as Nat Turner's rebellion. So that's also important because we can speak to how like these experiences and these like rebellions that we learn about, they're not these like anomalies or these outliers, which is a mathematical term. So remember how I talked about the first element of Histematics, numerical and verbal triggers. So that's like a verbal trigger. So we talk about outliers. Sometimes in history, we think like, oh, this happened one time and it like never happened again. But like, no, these things were like happening more frequently than they may be advertised as. So in the same year, you got Nat Turner, Southampton County, Virginia in August, right? A few months later, December 1831, you got these brothers and sisters down in Jamaica, like, are standing up for themselves, like, nah, we're rising up. We're not doing this. We're not about to keep doing this, right? So again, and also in different parts of the world. And then I mentioned the Haitian Revolution earlier, how that I believe, it's can be said that influenced Gabriel Prosser in the year 1800 in Richmond, Virginia, and just all these types of things. So we can also talk about how many years ago this was, and and they lasted 11 days. Now, also, there were 300,000 enslaved Africans at the time on the island of Jamaica, right? 60,000 of them were mobilized. So one of the things we can discuss is we can talk about percentages. We can talk about fractions, like what fraction of the enslaved Africans were mobilized. 60,000 out of 300,000. That's a mathematical exercise, right? One fifth, right? So we say one fifth of those enslaved were, and it's a whole, we can go through the whole process of like explaining that, step by step, but it also provides, it's an application. It provides context. And when you actually are connecting stories to mathematical practice, what you're doing is you're giving meaning to the math. So then, it's less of a chance and less of a likelihood for children to say things like, which actually makes sense. This seems irrelevant. When am I going to use this? Why do I need to learn this? Because oftentimes the way math is taught is very abstract. It's just a bunch of random equations and letters, plus signs and minus signs, right? With no story connected to it. So there has to be more application and more word problems, if you will, because that's what this is. It's a word problem. Because if you're having a conversation about the Christmas Rebellion or the Baptist Rebellion in Jamaica, and then you just want to kind of get a deeper understanding of what was really happening by using mathematics as a tool, right? As a tool, not just some class that a lot of children dread and hate to have to go to for an hour of a day, 5 days a week, for 10 months out of the year, for all their lives from age of 5 to the age of 17 or whatever, right? Math becomes a tool that's useful so you can better understand the story. And it's really the same thing we do anyway. Like if somebody's telling us a story, in order for the story to make more sense, we're using mathematics anyway. That's why when we know somebody's lying to us, what do we say? Something's not adding up. What's going on? I don't think this makes sense. You know what I mean? So again, 60,000 out of 300,000, that's one fifth of the enslaved population. That's also 20% of the enslaved population. So what does that look like? So it kind of goes to show, well, everybody, all 300,000 were involved, but you may not need for there to be all 300,000 involved. Or you may realize, well, if they were unsuccessful, maybe we did need 300,000 to be involved, or maybe we needed 40% to be involved, or 50% to be involved. Maybe that would have been more beneficial. But it enables us to have like some different conversations. Also, on the island of Jamaica at the time, the enslaved actually outnumbered the whites by a ratio of 12-1. So again, we're introducing ratios, and I want to make another point about ratios and the importance of ratios and fractions really. So it really starts with fractions, right? So so many children will say that they hate fractions. I guarantee you, any of you can go find like some teenagers right now, find a group of teenagers, group of young people, ask them how they feel about fractions, how they feel about them, like viscerally, what is their visceral feeling about fractions? Many of them will tell you they hate fractions, right? with all of their soul, right? This is very critical. And this is why I say this is very critical, because if a person does not understand fractions as a concept and does not know how to do different arithmetic with fractions, they then will not be able to really understand ratios. And if you don't understand ratios, there's a continuum, right? If you don't understand ratios, you won't understand proportions. If a person doesn't understand proportions, then you won't be able to understand disproportionate relationships, disproportionate distribution or allocation of resources. So when your community is being taken advantage of, is being exploited and oppressed, you may not even recognize it because you don't understand the mathematics behind it. It's a mathematical relationship. And then someone can tell you, well, your community got $100,000 for this. And then the other community got $100,000 also. But if you don't understand why there should be an issue if your community has a whole lot more people than the other community, you won't even know to say anything because they'll just tell you, well, look, it's equal. Y'all got the same. Wait a minute. It's not equitable. We're not supposed to get the same. We have more people. So when you break it down in terms of a ratio, we each person, how much is that if you allocate it per person on a per capita basis, if you will, like what does that break down to? But that requires an understanding of ratios and proportions, which requires an understanding of fractions. So there need to be more opportunities. This is why I'm pushing Histematics whenever possible, right, to anybody who will listen, because we need to create more opportunities, and even outside of the schools, even just as parents, grandparents, uncles, aunts, concerned people in the community, just to have conversations, have different types of conversations with young people to give them opportunities to learn about these different things. So While we're talking, you're talking about your family history, or you're talking about some plans that you have for a certain day, right? We can talk about fractions, and we can speak the language of fractions, right? Just things that might be seemingly insignificant, but in fact are very significant because, fractions are really a language. Just like mathematics overall is a language, fractions are a kind of like a subset of the language of mathematics. And so, instead of, if you order a pizza on a Friday night, you know, if your child has one slice of pizza, a large pizza is typically cut into 8 slices. You could say you have one slice of pizza, but you could also say you just ate 1/8 of the pizza, right? So we're introducing the concept of fractions and the language of fractions, and we're normalizing that, making that part of their lexicon, fractions, right? So these are just some things that some ways in which we can discuss the Christmas rebellion. And I mentioned Samuel Sharp, you know, uh, led this. And also, again, we talk about context, right? We talk about other rebellions that were going on. It is said that the sisters and brothers on the island of Jamaica were influenced heavily by the Demerara slave revolt of 1803, which took place in Guyana, right? Guyana, some well-known Guyanese people, ancestors, Walter Rodney. Walter Rodney was Guyanese. Ivan Van Sertima. Ivan Van Sertima, um, well-known African centered historian, also from Guyana. So again, like these were, these slave rebellions and slave revolts were influenced by other slave rebellions, and it's important for us to see this and there's no shortage of slave rebellions for us to talk about. So this is why, like, as I've mentioned multiple times on this presentation, I'm a heavy advocate of just talking about slave rebellions more, because it's really, it's people standing up for their humanity, you know. Um, so this rebellion, it started, as I mentioned, started on Christmas Day, right? Grew into a full rebellion by December 27th of 1831. It ended on December 28th. There was a local militia that was put together, right, which defeated the group, right? 14 free blacks and 200 rebels considered the enslaved Africans that left the plantation, had been killed. And that afterwards, 300 enslaved men and women were executed, including Samuel Sharp. Samuel Sharp, who was known as the leader of the rebellion, was also executed. And this was one of the events that pushed Great Britain to end slavery in its colonies in 1838. And these are so again, with every piece of information that we have, about this, we can create mathematical problems, right? So if, we can talk to young children, about arithmetic and say, well, if the United States ended slavery in 1865, or unless you say 1863 when the Emancipation Proclamation was passed, if you want to use that date, we can talk about the difference between those two dates, right? Um, these are just some options that we have, you know. So the next rebellion is, and this is timely since the Super Bowl is going to be in New Orleans this year. So when I think of New Orleans, I think of the German Coast Rebellion, right? I think of our ancestors standing up, right, and fighting back and going to war, basically, right, asserting their humanity and this, and attempting to get free. So yeah, so this took place in the year 1811, right? From January 8th to January the 11th. And in what's modern day 3 parishes, it was, took place over was kind of spread out, right? St. John the Baptist Parish, St. Charles Parish, and Jefferson Parish. And, the participants, they marched from Laplace, Louisiana, present day Laplace, Louisiana, to New Orleans. So again, I would say, how old were you in 1811? How old were you? And there are different ways to do the math. Another beauty of this is that, and this is one of the reasons I like math, because with mathematics, there are so many options in terms of how to solve problems. So, earlier when I was calculating my own negative age in comparison to the Christiana slave revolt, right? I used a certain form of subtraction. Some of us may use what's called a standard algorithm, right? where you like just write the numbers down and like stack one number on top of the other and then do the subtraction that way, right? Um, if I had more time, I probably would actually show some of the different math, methods, in this presentation. But for now, I'm just going to verbalize them. But feel free to, go to my YouTube channel, the All This Math YouTube channel, if you want to learn more about the different actual methods where I break them down step by step. Different methods of doing addition, different methods of doing subtraction, different methods of multiplication, division, solving equations, what have you. Anything ranging from arithmetic up to calculus, right? You can see on the All This Math YouTube channel. Please subscribe, like, and comment, share, whatever. Tell people about it. It's math tutorial videos infused with Black history is how I like to think of it. So how old were we in the year 1811? And if the rebellion took place over a 4-day period, how many hours is that? That's a calculation, right? We say, okay, there's a 24 hours in a day, right? And this is 4 days, right? How many hours is that? 24 times 4. So we're practicing math, and we're practicing math in circumstances and situations where we might not normally be practicing math. It's 11:15. We got 15 minutes left. Let me kind of Donovan, should I keep going or should I allow time for questions? I know that the chat seems to be
Uh,
like
the
lit right
chat
now.
is jumping. People are giving you your flowers, so it's totally up to you. I say keep going if you
Keep
want.
going, keep going, keep going.
Okay, I mean I'm almost finished anyway. This is
Okay,
the last rebellion
cool,
I was
cool,
going to
cool.
talk
Yeah,
about.
keep going. Yeah.
But yeah, so just as we go through the information, like when I was growing up in school, oftentimes I would learn the information, but I'm just realized kind of like with one of the things I realized in my own teaching experience is that something like that gamblers tend to say, like about like leaving money on the table, like don't leave money on the table, right? So I think what I realized, I've been doing in my own educational practice as a teacher is I was leaving money on the table because in my math classes, when I'm dealing with these numbers have historical significance, and I could have used those numbers to teach the history at the same time because my students also needed to learn that history that they weren't learning in the school in their history classes. They weren't learning in their community. They weren't learning in their household because maybe their own parents didn't know. So you can't teach somebody something that you don't even know, right? So this is like a method of trying to like not leave money on the table by taking advantage of every opportunity to teach and to kind of decompartmentalize education and to teach the math and the Black history at the same time. So even if it's done effectively, then a person really should know what class they're in because somebody might just wait, is this a math class? Wait, is this a history class? Which is it? I don't know. You know, if it's done effectively, there should be the line should be very extremely blurred. It should be extremely blurred. You shouldn't even know. That means that it's been decompartmentalized. Which I actually have a theory. I think that the way Western education is so compartmentalized, it actually serves to confuse us because I think that we kind of process information in a certain way and we begin to believe that one thing doesn't have anything to do with the other. Because I sat in this room for an hour for all my life, from being a child to a teenager, I sat in this room for an hour and we talked about this subject. And then a bell rang and I went to another room and we talked about this subject. So I was under the impression that this doesn't have nothing to do with that because we did it in different places. And even in like elementary school, it's like, okay, well, yeah, we're in the same room, but this is time for this and that's time for that. So it still kind of pushes this kind of idea, I think subconsciously that, to make us think that like history has nothing to do with mathematics. History may have nothing to do with chemistry when all these things are very interconnected. Everything has got to do with everything, right? So yeah, we can talk about like how many hours did the rebellion last? With Charles Delande and the other participants, how many minutes did it last? How many seconds? We can do all this math. How long was the journey? So if it was a 20-mile long march from Laplace to New Orleans, in terms of that's the ground that they covered. Again, we can do the unit conversion from the imperial units, which are miles, to the metric system of kilometers. we can go. We can do that. And I think like unit conversions are very important in terms of just understanding the how comparing distances, comparing weights. Um, it's actually a form of it's a way to also teach ratios, you know. So yeah, so this and then so this rebellion was thwarted. It wasn't as it didn't achieve the intended goal. However, again, every rebellion I believe was successful in the fact that it let slaveholders know that it wasn't sweet. Like, people will fight back, right? Which I do believe led to the Civil War and chattel slavery ending, and this country transitioning into Jim Crow and sharecropping, because in some ways slavery became too expensive. So even if we say, well, this rebellion was kind of thwarted by authorities, and people were executed and decapitated, which they were, and then their heads were put on display to discourage other people. um the fact that they had to do that, it's like, they that shows that, okay, we're sending a message. We're letting these authorities, we're letting slaveholders know that we're not it's going to be a fight. you know and again, like, my point that I've tried to kind of weave through this entire presentation is that this was a normal thing. This was not these were not outliers. These were not anomalies. Like, Black people were always fighting. And as we tell those stories, which are very necessary, about the fact that we were always fighting, we can teach mathematics and mathematics concepts at the same time, and it gives more meaning to the mathematics. So I'm gonna stop there, and we can address some questions. Um, I don't know how we do that though. How do I address the questions? I don't know how to
Yeah,
do
so
that.
there were no thank you first of all, Professor Parker, for your presentation. There were no I didn't see any questions in the chat, but if anyone has any questions, we have about 10 minutes. You can either pop it in the chat, or if you would like to raise your hand and unmute, we can do that as well.
I'm just scrolling through the comments right now. Let me go back to the ticket to the top.
Thank you, Mr. Parker. I actually have a question.
Yes.
Your presentation was really, really wonderful. Thank you also. Like, I particularly love Samuel Sharp's Rebellion. I feel like it gets overlooked a lot, so I'm really happy you highlighted that one. As somebody who's getting older and a history person, I feel like I'm just as bad as the kids when I say, like, I am not as good as math as I used to be. Um, and something I've just been thinking about, I love how you did, like, how old were you at this time?
hmm
Do you have tips? Because I imagine for, like, figuring out how old possible like your ancestors were, like your grandfather was born at this time, or perhaps your great grandfather was alive at this time. I'm also thinking too about Dr. Kelly Carter Jackson, who presented in our fall series. She talked about the Haitian Revolution in a book, We Refuse, and just how short the lifespan was on Haiti due to the brutality of the slave plantations there. So when we're factoring in perhaps how old our ancestors are, do you ever talk with students too about the lifespan of Black people during slavery specifically?
I don't think I have, actually. I think that's very important though. Just to as a way to teach about, like, as just like the vicious nature of slavery, and, like, what we had to endure. Um, but I think that's also an important thing to do. Yeah, definitely talk about lifespan, and how, like, the average age, and how people didn't live that long because of it's like, like Malcolm said, like, you were working, like, from can't see in the morning till can't see at night, and
Mhm.
you were just treated like a machine, just treated like a machine until you just couldn't work no more, and then you just you know so yeah, I definitely think those things are important. But yeah, and it's a way to do data analysis, and do a comparative analysis of ages back then, typical age on a plantation. And yeah, I'm glad you bring that up, because that is, I remember, yeah, definitely with, how brutal it was in Haiti because of, the sugar plantations. And the French were making a lot of money off of that. And, and they would just, just trying to just get as much as they could. Um, yeah. But yeah, it all could be quantified. It definitely all could be quantified. And I think it should. I think everything. That's the thing. That's another thing about like just with history. I think that even when we talk about, because sometimes like history can be anecdotal, but I think when you get into like the quantitative analysis of history, it goes beyond the anecdotal, and it's like, okay, no, because even like I remember reading, it was a book by which kind of opened my eyes to this, by Nkrumah, one of his many books, Neo-Colonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. And as I was reading through it, I was like, man, this is it's a historical book, but it's almost like a finance or economics textbook because Nkrumah was so specific about, like, he didn't just say, well, the Germans, stole from this nation in Africa, or the French stole this. Like, he told, like, to the specific amount, like how many tons of bauxite or like how many tons of iron ore, and just really, how much money that equated to at that time. And so I think when you talk about it that way, very specifically, because it's kind of like if somebody robs you, it's like, oh, I got robbed, it's messed up. But then if you say, well, this person actually was able to hack into my
It goes. Can't hear. Can't
Yeah,
hear it.
just lost
No.
audio for a second.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah. So it's like,
Thank you.
it's like it hits different because, okay, well, they were taking $212.36 every 2 weeks. So I know exactly how much they took, as opposed to just knowing that they took something, you know. So yeah, I'm all about like, quantifying history like as much as possible, you know. And a lot of it already is quantified, in different textbooks, but the children have to understand that quantitative analysis. Like I said in the beginning, like if they have to know percentages because they can read a number, read a percent symbol, but if you don't really know what that means, it's as if you're reading something that you don't know. It's like a lot of children, a lot of people, a lot of adults can recognize words and syllables and pronounce things, but they do not know how to read. They do not understand what they're reading, and they can't explain it.
Mhm.
But we can kind of fake it. A lot of people can fake it as long as you can pronounce words and recognize words. You can fake it, like, because and people get by in that way. In school, definitely. But it's unfortunate because, and you might wonder, like, well, because you might be in a room with a bunch of people and or people may not interpret things that they hear people say. You might be in a room with 50 people and you're like, this guy just said something crazy and everybody's clapping. Why are y'all clapping? You must not understand what he's just said. You must
No,
not really understand this.
I
So,
think I think your message is beautiful. The unfortunate part is a lot of older people who have access to these children need to learn some of these things to help not only the parents and the teachers. And a good suggestion from a former teacher: put some of this into when you talk to your parents.
mhm.
Fill out a little question or a little something to have them to deal with the children. It has nothing to do with homework. It has to do with culture. And sometimes, if you approach the adults in a certain way, they can be instrumental in helping you help the children with our history incorporating math. I'm going to silence myself. Thank you so much because you have given me so many ideas to help so many children. Thank you.
You're welcome. That's so I achieved my goal. I achieved my goal. Yeah. Because I also want math to, like, math is kind of marginalized. It's like that kind of subject that we kind of it's like a necessary evil. And I want math to come into the fray and be seen as a tool. It's like I want people to run to the math instead of running away from the math. Because the way is and a lot of times it's the way math is taught. It
Yes.
make you want to run away from it because it's not taught effectively. And I say that as a person early in my career, I didn't teach it effectively because I didn't know it well enough myself to really teach it effectively. I knew it as a student and a person. I knew content, but I didn't know really the real pedagogy behind it, and I didn't have a conceptual understanding of math. I was very much algorithm based. I knew like, okay, I memorize steps, and then I'm trying to teach students, listen, just memorize the steps. Don't ask no questions. Just memorize the steps. Just get the answer, because that's how I was taught. But that was easier for me to do because I had a strong foundation. A lot of students I've taught in the years, they may not have they didn't have as strong of a foundation. So you really can't just give them a formula and just say, listen, go rock out, replace the letters with the numbers, and just do the computation. You can't do that with them unless because if you don't have a strong foundation. But I don't think it's the best way to teach math anyway that way. Anyway.
I do have a question. Sorry, my hand was raised, and I'm not sure if they're going based upon like raised hands, but I did put my question in the chat. Is it okay that I ask my question, or
please
go
do.
ahead.
Other questions before?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I'm gonna tell you this, Dr. Parker. My friend literally just gave me this link and I jumped on because we're doing similar work here in New Jersey, right? Incorporating the experience of the enslaved, not from the trauma lens, right? From the resistance lens, from the agency lens. And I'm like, you just don't understand how excited I am to hear that you are doing this work. Yes, we definitely need to teach this across content area. And a lot of what I do notice is that we kind of like separate, or we just keep, slave history or slave this type of education within history or US, right? We do not bring it into math. We do not, well, we're trying to bring it into science. We barely bring it into ELA, right? So again, we're actually doing the exact same thing that you're doing. And I would definitely love to connect with you offline. I did send you a message in your Instagram. So
Okay.
go see Crystal Langford. So definitely so we can connect offline. But I wanted to, a question that I do have, since we are doing this work, how do you work across content areas, right? Like how do you get your colleagues on board since they're all teaching different things at different times?
So I'm not in a traditional school anymore. So
Okay.
I run my company, all this math, and I make YouTube content, and I make little reels on well, not little, but I make short reels on social media. Right. And I do a lot of math tutoring. So I do a lot of math tutoring, and I may do some like small group instruction, but I'm not in the traditional space anymore.
Okay.
So what would
you suggest,
that's a good question. Well, if they're open to it, some people just aren't open to it. They just, kind of want to do what they've always been doing. I guess find people that would be open to it. First try to find those people and work with them, and also be prepared for the reality that everybody may not be open to it. You may be an island. Well, I'm sure you already know this, right? But just don't let it discourage you is what I'm trying to say, because sometimes like we have these good ideas that we know are good, and then we think, well, everybody should want to be on board with this, and then when we find out people aren't, then we may get discouraged. But I'm saying just definitely don't let that happen, because even if something's a good idea, if it requires more work, people may not have the capacity or the bandwidth to like do the extra work, because you're really talking about creating like your own curriculum. You're going beyond what's already provided. And for some people, like this has become easier for me, because earlier in my career, I used to think to myself like, man, I wish that I could make more relevant math word problems. Like, and I just didn't know. I realized that I didn't know the math well enough to be able to do that more organically, more easily. But since then, I've gotten to the point where, because I've learned the math more deeply, I'm able to just create content that like aligns with I'm able to be more culturally relevant, basically. Because I really know the math. And I've also been studying the history. So for me now, when I'm studying some history, like the math problems jump out at me. They literally like jump off the page, because in my mind I'm like, whenever I see a number or I see like a relationship, it's like and I'm glad I've gotten to that point, but I wasn't always at that point. But early on, I think it does require more like work. So it may seem overwhelming to people when you introduce it to them, like, oh, we got to do this. Oh, you just added more work.
Right.
You know,
But just to preface, I am not a K-12 educator. I am a historian. So this is my passion, is to bring this thing to the schools and work with educators. However, I was able to get a foot in with a AP African American history teacher who is doing actually brought me in to talk about slavery. And I'm like, no, this is not the lens that I approach it. I look at the agency of the enslaved, right? So now our intent is like, okay, well, how do we work with, math teachers, science teachers, these different type of teachers as a collective, so that these students are really abiding by the Amistad Act that New Jersey had put in place about 20 some odd years ago, but we have yet to incorporate. So yeah, that's the reason why I was like, I'm not in K-12, I'm not in the classroom, but I was like, I'm doing this work as a historian because I am definitely passionate about our students knowing our history, right? And not that we're just our ancestors were passive, because we weren't, right? And there were different ways of resistance and rebellions. So we just kind of like put that in terms of like using culture as a way to do this. But I definitely would love to connect with you outside of this.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
We will.
Dr. Parker, I had a question.
Yes.
Okay, I'm Margaret Bristow from Masala, but I had just a comment about whether or not somebody had heard of this DVD that was circulating years ago called The African Origin of Math. African Origin of Math. And I saw it, Dr. Parker, looked at it and marveled at the contributions Blacks had globally toward math. It even mentioned that the fastest computer calculation was done by Nigerian. And I said, I passed it on to a middle school math teacher. And then I thought about it. I said, what was the name of that enslaved person in Alexandria, Virginia? Dr. Parker, I think they call him the Virginia calculator.
Yeah.
And he lived from 1710 to 1790. And his real name was Thomas Fuller. But he could calculate stuff so right as an enslaved person. And he may be subject of somebody's research. That could be across the disciplines too. His real name was Thomas Fuller, but he was called the Virginia calculator.
Yeah.
Enslaved man.
I remember learning about him in a book called Forging Freedom when we're running out of time, but real quick, but when I started teaching this class called African Americans in Philadelphia, which my students, this was back in 2011, my students renamed the class Black Philly, which actually was a more fitting name for it, actually. And ended up learning about him because Forging Freedom, I can't remember the author of that book. He was a historian. Can't remember his name.
I'm writing it down. Forging Freedom.
Yeah, it's called Forging Freedom. Was it Nash? It was like Black. It was a book focused on Black history in the city of Philadelphia. And but yeah, that's when I first learned about him, about Thomas Fuller.
Okay.
The Virginia calculator. And since then I've seen posts about him float around like on social media and whatnot.
Okay.
But yeah, but I put my my email in the chat. So please, anyone that wants to contact me or communicate with me or talk about professional development at your school or just build on some things, please feel free to reach out. Please also go to the YouTube channel, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and share it with whoever. I really want the YouTube channel to become a household name and a place where anybody can go to like math support. I try to break things down as simple and plain as possible. Like when Malcolm X say, make it plain. I try to make it plain. I try to make the math plain and make it make sense, and make it as culturally relevant as possible.
All right. Thank you again, Akil. This was amazing. We really appreciate you being here. Thank y'all for joining us, and we hope to see you at our February Black History Nerds. Y'all have a wonderful Saturday, and we will see y'all next time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.